and let us all do we can to build a better future.
Moving on then, with the role of comedy, right now there's this super fast rush of people trying to censor what can be said. You've talked about earlier how venues are standing against you, they're afraid of you, and look at what happened to Joe Rogan with Spotify. You have all these old rockers.
And by the way, the old rockers are back on Spotify, by the way. And by the way, the reason why they're back on Spotify is because they don't even own their own music. They sold their music to BlackRock, which is now raping the Amazon. And they sold their music to hedge funds. I don't know if it's BlackRock or Blackwater. So,
I think it's BlackRock. Blackwater is a former private military.
Okay, so one or the other, right? So, but they sold it to a private equity firm that's been the UN said made the housing crisis way worse by exacerbating their predatory practices with rental homes. Also, they're raping the Amazon forest, and so that's who owns Neil Young's music. That's who owns Crosby, Stills. That's who owns their music, and they don't even have control of their goddamn music, and they're pretending like they give a shit about something. And these are the same people who used to do rallies against GMOs. Now, if you have a question about an experimental vaccine, you're somehow a bad person and I'm taking my music down? That's called inconsistent. What a squiggly line of morality they have, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, what has annoyed me about everyone trying to censor comedy, is that comedy, the role of it, is to ridicule everything.
That's right.
Or poke holes in everything.
That's right.
Everything is open for ridicule, from world leaders to ideas, the U.S. Constitution, religion, everything's open for ridicule. But there's so much hypocrisy around, I guess, social justice warriors or people who are so thin-skinned that if you tell a joke, you're committing a war crime.
So this is just about control. It doesn't have anything to do with protecting anybody, or it's just control and power. And I mean, look what they did to Dave Chappelle, right? But Netflix stood by him, right? So I think there's a backlash starting to happen when Johnny Depp was, so Joe Biden ended #MeToo. So the liberals and I use that at a pejorative, by the way. I used to consider myself a liberal my whole life, up until, I don't know, Barack Obama. Because if that's what liberalism is, I'm not a liberal. That's Barack Obama and the Democrats are a right-wing conservative party, and that is not who I am. I am a left-wing, and I'm much closer to a socialist than I am to Jeff Bezos. Okay, so I'm like Richard Wolff. I believe in, democracy in the workplace and stuff like that. So, I forget what I was saying. What was the question?
Well, the question is, I mean, the thing, I did more of a conversation or a statement that is, there is a lot of pushback towards comedy on social media, people trying to censor comedians like Dave Chappelle, like Joe Rogan, like yourself. And it's starting to get out of hand.
And Joe Rogan, the reason why they came at Joe Rogan was because he was to the left of the Democratic Party, not because he's to the right of the Democratic Party, but that's their game. And I've told this to people on my show, if you get to the left of a liberal, they're not going to engage your idea. What they're going to do is they're going to first discredit you, then they're going to smear you, and then they're going to disingenuously engage your idea. That's what they did to Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's to the left of Nancy Pelosi. He's to the left of Chuck Schumer. Joe Rogan is like, tax people to fix this homelessness. Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders. Joe Rogan has never voted for a Republican in his life. Same thing with me, but they call me alt-right, just like they do them, because you get to the left of them, and they've got nothing but smears. That's all they have left. And so that's the control, because Joe Rogan is 10, 11, 12 times more popular than Anderson Cooper, Jake Tapper, Don Lemon. Nobody's watching who's watching those shows? Not even 1 million people at a moment. Joe Rogan gets 11, 12, 30. He got 2 million more subscribers as they were trying to discredit him, because that brought more eyes to him. And then people watch him. They go, this guy's a thoughtful, interesting dude who's doing shows like nobody else. And that's why he reinvented interviews, right? Interviews used to be 6 minutes on David Letterman and Jay Leno, and they were vapid, shallow, and did nothing. They're still like that on Jimmy Kimmel. They're still like that on The Tonight Show and on Stephen Colbert. But Joe Rogan's doing 3-hour in-depth interviews that I was told you couldn't do on podcasts. That's too long. People won't listen. He reinvented it. He made it better. I mean, he's doing Charlie Rose for 3 hours, but better than Charlie Rose, because Charlie Rose only wanted to hear himself talk. Joe Rogan is a great interviewer. He gets better all the time, and he's not right. He's actually left. And the reason why he might, I heard people like Jimmy, but he said he wouldn't mind DeSantis as president, and he's a right-winger. Do you realize how bad the Democrats are, that they actually have the ability to make a guy like DeSantis look attractive? That's what's happening. That's because DeSantis actually gave his people in Florida monoclonals. Nobody else, they wouldn't do that in a blue state. They wouldn't do, you couldn't get monoclonals in blue states, but you could in red states. By the way, what are monoclonals? Those are a treatment for COVID-19. How effective is monoclonals? 80% effective. So anyway, I could go into the numbers and the stats on COVID. Right. You know, according to Pew, 0.89% of people who get COVID end up hospitalized. That's less than 1%. So now if you have a treatment that drops that down by 80%, now what percentage of people are still being hospitalized? So I don't understand how they still have an emergency use authorization when we have a treatment. The only reason why you're supposed to get an emergency use authorization is because there's no other treatments. And that's why they wanted you to think ivermectin was horse poison, which ivermectin is, of course, a Nobel Prize winning medicine for humans in 2015, not 30 years ago, but just a few years ago. And it's also on the WHO list of essential medicines. So that's why they had to make you think that ivermectin was horse poison, because if it could treat COVID-19, they couldn't get their emergency use authorization for their vaccines. And then a couple of $100 billion goes out the window, right? Which is a lot of money. Think about how much money the big pharma is making off the vaccines. Do you know how much the entire music industry, recording music industry makes in the United States? And that's from Mozart to Snoop Dogg to everybody in people who are current. You know how much money they make? $12 billion a year.
Christ.
That's what Pfizer makes in the first quarter. They double that in the first quarter this year, Pfizer. They made like $25 billion in the first quarter. So what does that mean, Jimmy? That they're really rich? That also means that they're super powerful. You know how much power that kind of money brings you? It brings you enough power to get everybody in corporate media to call an essential medicine that won the Nobel Prize a horse poison. That's how much power it gives you. And why did they have to do that? Because it could have worked, and then they couldn't get their vaccines. And now we have a treatment called monoclonals, and still we have emergency use authorization for these vaccines, which I don't understand. Oh, I do. It's called corruption. The FDA is completely corrupted. The last head of the FDA is now on the board of Pfizer. Why is that legal? The FDA, 70% of their funding comes from Big Pharma. You cannot regulate somebody that funds you. And so they're 100% corrupt. And in fact, the two heads of the vaccine department at the FDA resigned over the boosters. You ever hear about that in the news? They ever talk about that? No. And so now they got the people who had a little integrity left at the FDA. Now they got them out, and they got the pharma shills back in. And the thing that is the creepiest is how they get people like comedians who are supposed to be anti-establishment and poking holes in the establishment narrative. They got them to do big pharma propaganda for free. They're vigilantes for big pharma. They have no critique of big pharma. They have no critique of the vaccines. They have no critiques of Tony Fauci, who's a criminal and should have been in prison decades ago. I caught him lying to Congress twice myself on my own show. And comedians have no criticisms of what's happening right now, which means they've become shills and propagandists. When you see a comedian get on stage and tell people don't do your own research, what they're really telling people is don't question authority and don't read. Stop reading. They don't realize that's what they're saying, but that is what they're saying. So if you think you're smart or clever and you think that you're going to talk down to somebody by telling them don't do your own research, you're being just as big a moron as the people you think you're insulting. There's nothing dumber than telling people not to question authority. There's nothing more anti-intellectual than telling people don't look into a medical treatment that they have to take. That is the opposite of intellectualism. That is anti-intellectualism. And that is the opposite of comedy. That is called 100% propaganda. And you've seen the comedians do it. You've seen the comedians on YouTube do propaganda for big pharma. People who claim to be government critics and skeptics are doing vigilante propaganda unpaid for the big pharma. And it's disgusting.
And so then a two-part question needs to come up. Is the future of comedy at risk of being overtaken by corporate neoliberalism. And the second point, are regular people waking up to the fact that we live in a neoliberal nightmare that's been designed by politicians and corporate media and, of course, by Hollywood. Are people waking up and breaking away from it? Is it too little too late?
I think a lot of people are waking up to it. I think a lot of people are getting... I mean, I just did a video on my show about how the Hollywood celebrities are waking up to the Democratic Party's bullshit.
They'll be sold out on
Deborah Messing was on some kind of White House. You know who Deborah Messing is? Yes. She's the biggest shitlib in the world, and she thinks Susan Sarandon should be blamed for the problems of our country, not people who actually have power.
Well, Jimmy, Susan Sarandon has absolute power. She's the queen of the world. At this point, it's a scientific fact. No one's going to argue that.
So I just did a story where there's a bunch of celebrities from Hollywood who claim that they got Joe Biden elected. And they're upset that the Democrats aren't doing anything. So they're where Jimmy Dore was in 2015. And then for the last 7 years, I've been called a right-winger and a white supremacist and a guy who's undermining the Democrat and an enemy of all that stuff. I've been called for the last 7 years. And now that Joe Biden's been president for a year and a half and the Democrats have complete control of government, they've got nobody they're still blaming Tucker Carlson. They're still blaming Joe Rogan. They're still blaming Ralph Nader, Susan Sarandon. But now the Hollywood celebrities are like, wait a minute. Maybe the people that are elected should do something. Maybe they should do something. AOC was just, I told you this like I started the story. She was on Glenn Greenwald last night and said, not Glenn, she was on Stephen Colbert last night, and she said that if you vote for Democrats, Democrats will fight for your civil rights. And of course, Stephen Colbert just let her say it. Instead of saying, hey, aren't you guys in complete control of government right now? Have you ever fought? When did you ever fight, AOC? You've never fought for anything. Oh, you remember that stunt she did at the Capitol steps where they pretended to sleep in to help people who were being evicted? That was a complete stunt. Nothing they did anything, and they still went home.
Yeah, and then, of course, Frank Analysis, shout out to Frank Analysis,
That's right.
By the way. He caught that video where he said, well, wait, nothing's done.
Nothing's happening.
Nothing's happening. You just kicked the can down the road, and then I think it was one of Cory Bush's aides or Cory Bush herself
said, turn up the music.
Turn on the music, and then everyone danced, and that was going on. Frank Analysis. Great video that you caught that.
They're dancing on the evictions of poor people. That's what they were doing. Hey, I don't want to hear about poor people's problems. Let's turn up the music. They did what you would think Nancy Pelosi would do. So that's the usefulness of people like Cory Bush and AOC. They're scammers, liars. They're self-dealing politicians who will never fight for you except to pretend to. So what that's called is gaslighting. What Cory Bush and AOC did was piss in our face and tell us it's raining because they are fucking corrupt politicians. And people don't want to hear that. Just like people didn't want to hear that about Bernie Sanders is a fucking coward who will always roll over for the establishment. Right now, he's doing the bidding of Joe Biden, which means he's doing the bidding of Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. That's what a piece of fucking shit Bernie Sanders is. And he's a coward. He wouldn't even go on Kyle Kalinski's show. He's afraid of Kyle Kalinski. That's what a fucking
Malinsky.
That's what a pussy Bernie Sanders is. You think he's going to stand up to Joe Biden and the banks? He won't even stand up to Kyle Kalinski.
All people.
A guy who's afraid of his own shadow. Kyle Kalinski's afraid of his own shadow. He won't mention my name on his show because every time he does, he loses another 10,000 fucking viewers.
You know what's interesting though, because when you bring up Bernie, what I find interesting is in 2016, Daniel and myself, we were there at the convention. We snuck in through the front door, no press passes or anything like that, and we saw firsthand how Hillary Clinton supporters were treating Bernie Sanders supporters.
And he took it and didn't do anything.
And nothing happened. And
they cheated him, which means they cheated democracy, which means they cheated.
But he let it happen.
And he was not only let it happen, he was complicit. Bernie Sanders went out and then campaigned for that piece of garbage. He went out and said they were all great people and how much better we were going to be if we had these fucking corrupt criminals who just cheated half the party if they were in power. He made no demands for them to fix it. He made no demands for them to make reparations with us. He didn't even demand to be vice president. If he was on that ticket as vice president, Hillary Clinton would have won.